Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank the organizers for inviting me to speak at this very interesting event with a wide audience. So congratulations also to the organizers. I'm going to give a very brief presentation, which should last about 10 minutes. So I think I was actually very pleased to hear the previous presentation by Vasilina, because on many points, I think the OECD and the World Economic Forum agree. And it's good, I think, if we are thinking about building a future labor market, that there's certain consensus that emerges. This conference is really important because now, because of the crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, there is more and more emphasis on the risk of jobs disappearing. I think there is some emphasis on on businesses focusing on robots as a substitution for workers, because robots offer so many advantages compared to workers, in the sense that they do not get sick. Social distancing is not an issue anymore. So there's increased pressure towards automation. So this makes all these trends that we were talking about even before the COVID-19 crisis even more important. So for years now, people have been worrying about the rise of new technologies, the rise of robots, algorithms that replace human beings in some of the tasks that they do. There's a lot of anxiety, I think, in public rhetoric and in newspapers and newspaper articles that you read. Even among academics, I think there are some fearful stories that go around. You may be familiar with some estimates that say that 50% of jobs are likely to be automated within the next 10 to 20 years. Some people think it's a very bad time to be alive for workers with just normal skills, because robots and algorithms can increasingly do these. But in our opinion, it's far from obvious that these cataclysmic views will actually be realized in practice. Technology also creates many jobs, new jobs. And what I will do in this presentation is present some new OECD evidence that, at least over the last few years, this has been the case. If you look at OECD countries, in every single OECD country, between 2012 and 2019, so this is a period of 7 to 8 years, employment has grown, despite the adoption of new automating technologies. Now, you may not see the detail here in terms of which countries I'm presenting, but what is important here is that everything, all the bars go to the right, not a single one is negative. There's been employment growth in every single country. And I think the two highlights I want to show is, first of all, the blue line, which is the average for the OECD. So over this relatively short period, we have seen nearly 10% increase in jobs in OECD countries. And Latvia in red at the bottom may not be a star performer in terms of employment growth, but in Latvia also you have seen employment growth. And Latvia is, surrounded by countries like Norway, France, Italy, and Finland in terms of employment growth over this period. Similarly, when you look at occupations, a similar story emerges. So here I break everything down by occupation, and you do see employment growth in the vast majority of occupations over that period of time, so between 2012 and 2019. But some interesting stories start arising here. So just to highlight a few occupations where we've seen very rapid employment growth, and I think this matches what was said in the previous presentation. So in ICT, in management functions, in health professionals, we have seen very fast growth in demand and the number of jobs in these occupations. Whereas at the bottom, there's actually been some declines in some occupations, in some manufacturing occupations, also in some agricultural occupations. And these are all occupations where robots and automating technologies have taken a strong hold. Now, the interesting question, of course, is what I've just said. Is there actually a relationship between automation and the pattern that you see here by occupation? And so this is something that we've done recently at the OECD. We estimated about in 2012 that 14% of jobs in OECD countries were at high risk of automation. So the question then arises, what actually happened in those occupations that were at high risk of automation? And this exercise throws up something very interesting. This graph, and I want you to focus in particular on the downward sloping line. This graph shows you first on the vertical axis, the risk of automation. And then on the horizontal axis, it shows you on the horizontal axis, it shows you the risk of automation. And on the vertical axis, it shows you employment growth. And what is interesting is that there is a negative relationship. So occupations that we estimated to be at high risk of automation did indeed see lower employment growth. And in some cases, there was negative employment growth in these occupations. So automation, the risk of automation does seem to come with a certain amount of pain in the labor market. And again, it's the same kind of occupations in agriculture, forestry, fishery, in manufacturing, whereas health professionals, ICT, teaching professionals, there was a low risk of automation and high employment growth. So at the occupational level, we do see an impact of automation on employment growth. But now what is very interesting is when you take this to the country level, because at the country level, when you look at the average risk of automation and compare that to employment growth, there's actually a positive relationship. So countries that faced on average a higher risk of automation back in 2012 have seen a higher growth rate in employment over the period. Now, this may seem puzzling to you, but there are plenty of stories that are compatible with this. And one of the main ones that emerges from the academic literature is that technology and the adoption of new technologies leads to increases in productivity. Productivity increases wages, it increases demand for goods and services, and as a result, it increases demand for workers. So overall, the technology seems to be a good thing for the labor market. But again, there are certain transitions that are important, and this is something that I'll come to in the next slide. I've already shown differential growth rates by occupation. What that implies is that this also leads to differences in or changes in the demand for different types of skills. And in particular, one thing that we have seen is that, and this is the black bar that I want you to focus in on this in this particular chart, it shows you the growth in occupation and jobs for low educated people. And what you see is that in nearly every single OECD country, including in Latvia, there's been a decline in the number of jobs for low educated workers. Whereas in most countries, you see a very strong rise, in fact, in the number of jobs for high educated workers. So there are wonderful opportunities out there, but the challenge is to be able to grab these opportunities. Now, one silver lining perhaps, which I don't show you in this graph, but yes, there are fewer jobs for low educated people, but at the same time, in OECD countries, there have been massive increases in the average level of education of people. So the number of low educated people have also been falling. So in fact, the employment rates of low educated people have maintained more or less the same. But that doesn't mean that we can just rest now assured that everything will be fine. No, this trend of rising jobs in high skill occupations will continue. And we really need to make sure that these people who where jobs are disappearing have the skills and the abilities to get those jobs that are appearing. And I think this is where really the challenge lies, is in accompanying people in that change. So skills are changing, and this is the one chart which shows this. It focuses on Latvia, and it shows us where skills needs are emerging. It shows you what skills and abilities or knowledge areas are hard to find in the labor market, and where there's actually an excess of skills, where workers have skills that are not highly demanded in the labor market. And again, this squares very well with the chart on occupations, which I showed you earlier, because what employers want is verbal abilities. They want people who can solve complex problems. They want people with reasoning abilities. They also want engineers, people with technology skills, people who are qualified in education and training, who have social skills. Whereas the kind of skills and abilities that are in very low demand in the labor market are things like physical strength, people who manipulate things with their hands, endurance. These are the skills that are no longer needed in the labor market, or at least to a much lesser extent. Now, if I want you to take one message away from all this, it's that for the time being, there's no reason to be alarmist about the future of work and the changes that are happening. There's no need to be alarmist as long as you have the right policies in place. And the key thing here, I think, the key risk going forward is about inclusivity. It's about making sure that everyone can benefit from the opportunities that will rise and the opportunities that lie ahead. And what is really critical here is having training programs in place that accompany individuals, first of all, to keep the job that they are currently in, because the kind of tasks that they do and the skills that they need will change. So even just to keep the job that these people are in, they need investments in training, but also training programs to up and reskill so that people can grab opportunities elsewhere. You also need adequate social protection, because if people do need to change jobs, they need a bridge from one job to another, and social protection plays a critical role here. And finally, and this is something I haven't mentioned in detail, but it's something else that has emerged from our research, it's the importance of focusing on young people and on initial education. One thing that our research has shown is that the labor market is becoming more difficult for young people over time. This is a slow trend, but it's one that can easily be seen, and one I suspect has been accelerated by the COVID-19 crisis. Young people find it harder and harder to get a good foothold in the labor market. And one of the main reasons this is happening, when you think about the structural change that I presented, of course, there are some people, some older workers who lose their job as a result of automation, etc. But the main driver of structural change, or the main way employers change the demand for skills, is through new recruitments. So young people who enter the labor market now are looking at very different jobs than young people did 10 or 20 years ago. So we need to make sure that our education programs prepare young people for the jobs and the skills that are needed now in the labor market. And I think that's a very important lesson, that we need to focus on young people entering the labor market. Now, before I finish and hand the word to Piret, I just want to say one more thing. Many of the things I have said are historically true. And so there is reason to believe that this will continue to be true in the future. Now, there are many new technologies. And of course, I don't have a crystal ball. Nobody has a crystal ball. One of the big new technologies that a lot of people are talking about is artificial intelligence. And there are some reasons to believe that AI will have a different impact on the labor market, or an impact at least that we should carefully follow and monitor. It's a technology that will affect many occupations and many industries. It's a technology that will affect high-skilled workers as well as medium-skilled workers and low-skilled workers. And it's also a technology which brings huge ethical implications in terms of bias, in terms of transparency, in terms of explainability. Again, don't get me wrong, AI offers plenty of opportunities for creating better and more productive and better paid jobs, but there are also risks ahead. And we will be monitoring these closely at the OECD. And we have engaged on a huge new program of work to monitor the impact of AI on the labor market. If you're interested in hearing more about this program of work and how you might get involved, please don't hesitate to contact me at these details. And I now hand the floor over to my colleague, Piret. Thank you.